Picture this, a Senate budget hearing on June 7, 2026. The Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a politician whose entire career has been defined by a hardline stance on China, steps up to the microphone. And then he says something his colleagues absolutely do not want to hear. The United States and China have to talk. There is no alternative. In a Washington where China bashing has become a no-risk, high-reward political strategy, those words landed like a bomb. Why is one of America's most prominent hawks suddenly sounding cautious? Is this the beginning of a strategic retreat, or just a tactical pause? And what does it mean for the world's most complicated relationship? Let's unpack Rubio's no alternative moment and what it reveals about America's real position. First, the hawk's unexpected turn. Rubio's record is practically a roadmap of hawkish China policy. As a longtime senator, he pushed bill after bill targeting China on trade, human rights, technology, geopolitics. It made him popular with certain voters and interest groups. It also landed him squarely on China's sanctions list. That's exactly why his shift feels so jarring. After returning from a trip to China alongside President Trump, the newly appointed Secretary of State began publicly softening his tone and calling for dialogue. And it's not just personal evolution. It challenges a deeply entrenched business model in Washington. Here's the thing. Over the past few years, being tough on China has become one of the easiest ways for politicians to raise money, grab headlines, and fire up their base. Decouple, de-risk, threat, repeat. A whole political ecosystem has been built on this logic. When Rubio says we have to talk, he's essentially poking a hole in that system. He's admitting, whether he means to or not, that the maximum pressure approach may have hit a wall. The real shockwave? It comes from an insider. Someone who helped build that hawkish consensus is now signaling, out loud, that America's hand may not be as strong as everyone in Washington likes to pretend. Now, the gravity of reality. Why is there no alternative? Rubio's stance isn't some sudden enlightenment. It's forced by cold, hard facts. Let me walk you through 4 of them. Number 1. Economic entanglement. After decades of globalization, the U.S. and Chinese economies are woven together at every level: supply chains, technology, capital flows. Forcing a decoupling wouldn't be a clean surgical operation. It would be more like ripping the wiring out of a house while the lights are still on. Remember the tariff battles from earlier in the decade? American importers, retailers, and consumers paid the price. Farmers and manufacturers screamed. That pressure travels fast, straight to the desks of senators and congressmen. Rubio knows that pushing confrontation to the point of full-blown economic divorce wouldn't cause just a transitional pain. It could trigger a recession and blow up the fiscal deficit, a nightmare for any administration eyeing re-election. Number 2. Global problems don't work without China. Climate change, pandemic preparedness, nuclear non-proliferation, energy security. Name one major global challenge that can be solved without China at the table. You can't. Reaching enforceable international agreements, building new rules for global governance. All of it requires Chinese cooperation. Rubio's call for dialogue is basically an acknowledgement that if the U.S. wants to advance its own agenda on these issues, it has to talk to Beijing. Number 3. Strategic overstretch. Right now, American resources are stretched thin. Europe is still absorbing the aftershocks of the Russia-Ukraine war and simmering trade tensions with parts of the EU. The Middle East remains tense, with U.S.-Iran relations locked in a standoff. The Indo-Pacific, supposedly the strategic priority, simply cannot absorb a full-scale, all-fronts confrontation with China on top of everything else. Trying to manage all these theaters simultaneously is just too costly and too risky. Dialogue with China becomes a loss-limiting move, a way to keep the Pacific stable while Washington deals with crises elsewhere. Number 4. Domestic unpredictability. Let's be honest. The Trump administration is famous for its unpredictability. Allies and adversaries alike are often left guessing. That style can sometimes be a negotiating tactic, but it also dramatically increases the risk of miscalculation. When you're managing a relationship this big and this fragile, you need circuit breakers. Keeping communication channels open is the fuse that stops a misunderstanding from exploding into a full-blown conflict. Now, let's be absolutely clear. When Rubio says we must talk, he is not announcing a strategy change. This is a tactical adjustment. At that very same hearing, he let another key detail slip. The $14 billion arms sale to Taiwan has been paused, not canceled. Paused. That single word tells you everything. On one hand, the administration shows a pragmatic, cooperative face to stabilize the relationship and get things it needs from China. On the other, it's stockpiling bargaining chips, and Taiwan remains the biggest chip of all. So the real logic of the moment is this: competition first, communication to manage the risks. The goal is to prevent uncontrolled escalation, not to end the rivalry. In Washington's strategic community, China is still seen as the principal competitor, and that isn't going to change anytime soon. Now, what comes next? Rubio's words act like a mirror, showing us a few possible futures. Path 1. Competitive coexistence with limited cooperation. This is the most likely scenario. The two sides cooperate where interests overlap: climate, trade, financial stability, while competing fiercely in tech, military domains, and ideology. The relationship cycles through moments of tension and negotiation. This path demands sophisticated crisis management and enough guardrails to stop competition from crossing red lines. Path 2. Protracted stalemate and strategic attrition. Without real dialogue and trust building, we could sink into a sort of cold peace. Decoupling in high-tech deepens. Close military encounters multiply. The world fractures into rival blocs with different technology standards and spheres of influence. Global supply chains become less efficient. Innovation costs rise. It's a huge waste and a dangerous one. Path 3. Miscalculation and conflict. This is the nightmare scenario, one that must be avoided at all costs. In places like the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea, a single misstep or overly aggressive move could cascade. Rubio himself warned of maritime friction and geopolitical tensions spiraling into major trouble. Keeping dialogue alive is the single most important safeguard against that catastrophic outcome. No matter which path we end up on, one fact is inescapable: the internal pressures each country faces, political polarization and debt in the U.S., economic transition and demographic shifts in China, will reshape their foreign policies in ways neither side fully controls. So here is the conclusion. Rubio's no alternative moment peels away the tough ideological language and exposes a much simpler, more realist truth. When the cost of confrontation becomes unbearable, dialogue isn't a noble choice. It's the only rational one. Not a victory of morality, but a calculation of interests. For China, this American sobriety is both an opportunity and a test. The opportunity, a potential window to manage disputes and expand cooperation. The test, recognizing that America's competitive strategy hasn't changed. Dialogue is a tool, not an end. China will need strategic patience and firm bottom lines to protect its own development while staying prepared for whatever comes next. The world is watching. The trajectory of U.S. China relations will shape global stability and prosperity for decades. Can the two giants find a way to coexist? No conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win cooperation? That's the great political test of our time. Rubio's words may have been bitter medicine for his colleagues, but at least he admitted the necessity of talking. In an era this dangerous, simply sitting down at the table is already the first step away from the worst-case scenario. History might one day record that the sentence politicians hated most was exactly the warning they most needed to hear.